I suspected the night would be remembered for something. I just thought it would be the view. Lake Garda stretched below, like a mirror trimmed in light, a ferry drifting across its dark surface like a thought that hadn't decided whether to stay or leave. The waiter set a flute of Franciacorta at my right hand and an elderberry juice at my left, my cardiologist truce with celebration. Daniel lifted his glass toward mine, grinning the way he used to when he'd sneak coins from my desk. Sophie leaned in to kiss my cheek, her perfume soft and deliberate, the kind that lingered longer than manners allowed. 40 million, Papa, Daniel said, tasting the number. Now you can stop pretending to work. I never pretended, I said. I negotiated with time. Sophie smiled, candlelight catching in her eyes. The emerald silk of her dress moved as if it had its own memory, shaping to her body like water to stone. She wasn't mine to watch, but I watched anyway, the way one might study a painting they can never own. It wasn't flirtation exactly, but proximity can have its own gravity, the kind that pulls you without permission. We ordered lake trout and saffron risotto. Verona shimmered across the dark, the faint hum of distant music floating from the square. Daniel filled the air with talk of his latest venture, a word that lately meant debt dressed as ambition. I smiled, listening to the son I had once carried on my shoulders talk about investors and risk as though luck were a skill. He didn't notice my silence. He rarely did. To you, Dad, he said, lifting his glass again. To making it. To surviving it, I replied, and he laughed, not hearing what I meant. We drank. I took my elderberry juice for color and ritual. Daniel's wine had a bitterness he blamed on tannins. The waiter replaced it. Across the table, Sophie's fingers brushed Daniel's wrist, then withdrew as though the touch had burned her. Her smile afterward was faint, secretive. Sex, I've learned, lives in gestures, in a pause too long, in eyes that don't look away fast enough. I felt that quiet voltage between them and wondered if it had always been there, or if I was imagining it to make myself feel less old. When I excused myself to the terrace railing, the wind from the lake smelled of stone and night-blooming jasmine. From that vantage, our table looked like a stage, my son laughing too loudly, his wife tracing circles on her glass stem as if rehearsing an escape. The violinist below slid into a minor key, and something in the melody made my heart falter for no reason I cared to admit. When I returned, Daniel stood behind my chair, straightening my napkin and adjusting my cutlery with unnecessary precision. He smiled and said, "Your glass was close to the edge. Almost spilled." His hand brushed the rim of my elderberry glass as he moved it closer to me. A small gesture, one that meant nothing, then. I thanked him. Fathers do that. We thank our children for pretending to care. Dessert came. Panna cotta with burnt sugar, sweet and faintly bitter. Sophie talked about a Milan art gallery she had visited where the walls were so white, she said, you could hear your own thoughts. Then she added, Lydia's favorite painting would belong there, don't you think? The Calm Before Dawn, I said, and Lydia's name turned the air inside me cold. Sophie lowered her eyes, her voice softening. She had been kind to Lydia in the end, reading to her, cooking soups. That small kindness made me forgive her for things she hadn't yet done. We lingered long after midnight. Daniel insisted on paying, made a scene of it, the good son rewarding the father who had finally made it. He kissed my forehead before we left, and I almost believed it was love. In the elevator, Sophie stood beside me. Her shoulder brushed mine, and the contact sent a slow current down my arm. She looked up, lips parted slightly, and said, I'm happy for you, Edward, for what you built. It was the way she said you, as though she were testing how it felt on her tongue. Outside, the air was cool, clean, merciless. They walked me to my car, waved, and disappeared into the night. I drove the curving road home in silence, the lake glinting between the trees. At my villa, the clocks ticked like witnesses. I poured a glass of water and looked out at the reflection of the moon in the window. That's when my chest began to tighten, a dull pressure that spread like spilled ink. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered against the marble. The next thing I knew, the world tilted and went dark. I woke to a doctor's calm voice and the sterile brightness of a hospital room. A mild cardiac episode, Senior Halston. Rest. No drama. No drama. I almost laughed. By morning, I was back in my villa, bruised by exhaustion but grateful for the quiet. Daniel called first. His concern sounded rehearsed, every word polished. "Dad, how are you feeling?" We were terrified. "Just indigestion," I lied. "The doctor says I'm fine." His sigh, relief, came too quickly. Then Sophie's voice followed, low and even. "You scared us. Try to rest, all right?" Her tone had warmth, but not the kind that reached the heart. When we hung up, the house fell into its old rhythm. The kettle sighing, the lake breathing outside, the ghost of Lydia's laughter caught in the curtains. I was reaching for Dante on the table when the phone rang again. Unknown number. "Signore Halston," the voice said, accented, cautious. "I am the night security from the restaurant. Forgive me, but I must tell you what I saw." Something in his tone straightened my spine. "Go on." "Your son," he said, and hesitated. "He poured something into your glass when you went to the railing. I thought perhaps medicine. After you left, I checked the cameras. It was not from the bottle on the table." The air in the room thinned. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The lake outside seemed to pause, as if waiting for me to answer. I wanted to tell the man he was mistaken, that my son was incapable of such a thing. But the body remembers. Mine had already told me the truth hours before, clenched around my heart like a warning. "Thank you," I said finally, and ended the call. I sat there, staring at the empty glass on the counter, the one Daniel had moved with such care. The taste of elderberry still lingered on my tongue, sweet and faintly metallic. I turned to Lydia's photograph on the mantel. She was smiling, alive, the lake behind her a ribbon of light. "You warned me," I whispered. "You said love turns dangerous when it wants what it doesn't deserve." Outside, a scooter started, its hum fading down the hill. The city kept being beautiful, indifferent to everything it destroyed. I stood very still, counting each breath as if I were practicing survival. Beside the glass, I placed a pen. The celebration was over. What came next would be the reckoning. Silence has its own temperature. In the mornings it felt cool against my skin, like the marble floors of the villa under bare feet. I woke to that silence for 5 days straight, each dawn tasting faintly of copper and regret. The doctor had said rest, but rest isn't something the guilty are granted, even when their crime is only survival. The first morning after the collapse, I moved through the house as though it belonged to someone else. The air still smelled faintly of burnt sugar from the dessert Sophie had praised, and I hated that scent for what it reminded me of. Her soft laughter, Daniel's careless hand, the glass that nearly ended me. The body heals faster than the mind, they say, but mine healed suspiciously well. It was my trust that remained on life support. Daniel called every day at noon. "Dad, how are you feeling?" We were so worried. His voice always sounded like a performance, lines rehearsed in front of a mirror. I could almost hear Sophie prompting him in the background. "Just indigestion," I told him, each time more casually. "The doctor says I'm fine." The pause after that sentence was always the same length, 2 beats of silence, a sigh, and then relief. That sigh was his confession. If I closed my eyes, I could see his expression, the smile creeping back, the weight sliding off his shoulders. He believed I hadn't seen through him. That was my advantage. I spent the days pretending to recover. My nurse visited in the afternoons, leaving instructions I ignored. I sat on the terrace overlooking the lake, watching the ferries cut silver paths across the water. At night, I replayed every detail of the dinner in Verona, the way Daniel shifted in his seat when the waiter poured his drink, the strange gleam in his eyes when I mentioned Lydia's painting, the way Sophie's gaze lingered on me, not with affection, but calculation disguised as concern. She had always fascinated me. Sophie knew how to inhabit silence, how to tilt her head and let her hair fall in a way that suggested listening when she was really planning. Even now, the memory of her perfume haunted the villa like an unfinished thought. I didn't want to desire her, but desire doesn't care for propriety. It feeds on danger, on forbidden edges. and now everything about her was dangerous. One evening, I found myself in my study, staring at the photograph of Lydia again. My late wife's beauty had been the quiet kind, steady, unpretentious. The opposite of Sophie's. Lydia once told me that Sophie reminded her of fire, bright, alive, and bound to burn anything too close. "You've spoiled him, Ed," she'd warned me once, her voice weak from illness. "He doesn't see you as a father anymore. He sees you as a gatekeeper." At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now her words returned like prophecy. On the third day, I received a letter from the restaurant manager, apologizing profusely for the unfortunate health incident. I almost laughed. If only they knew how unfortunate it could have been. The manager enclosed a business card, the security guard's name scribbled on it in shaky penmanship. Carlo Sardi. I placed it in the drawer next to Lydia's rosary, a relic of faith I no longer believed in. The nights were harder. Sleep came in fragments. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt again the pressure in my chest, heard Daniel's laughter echoing against the stone walls of the restaurant. Sometimes I woke to phantom whispers, Lydia's voice mingling with Sophie's in a dream I couldn't untangle. By the fifth morning, I had made a decision. If Daniel wanted me dead, I would let him believe I was dying. It was a cruel plan, perhaps, but cruelty was the language my son had chosen, and I was fluent enough to reply. I would give him what he wanted most, the illusion of inheritance. I'd dangle it before him like a carrot before a starving horse. And when he reached for it, I'd see what kind of man he truly was, if there was anything left of the boy I once taught to fish, or if greed had eaten him whole. Before acting, I needed an ally. I called Isabel Moretti, my attorney and friend for nearly 20 years. Isabel had the kind of mind that could turn sympathy into strategy. Her voice, when she answered, was smooth and careful, like velvet concealing steel. "Edward," she said, "I heard what happened. How are you feeling?" "Alive," I told her. "More than I was a week ago." She understood the tone immediately. "What do you need?" "Discretion," I said, "and a bit of theater." We agreed to meet in Florence within a few days. Until then, I had to keep up appearances, responding to Daniel's calls with patience, pretending to believe his concern, acting like the grateful father who'd narrowly escaped fate. That evening, I poured myself a Real glass of wine, ignoring the doctor's instructions. The first sip burned in the best possible way. Outside, the lake reflected the last streaks of sunset, the same gold Lydia once called the color of forgiveness. I wondered if forgiveness had any place left in me. The phone rang again. "Daniel." "Right on schedule." "Dad." "How's the heart holding up?" he joked. "It beats," I said. "Stubborn thing." He laughed too loudly. Then came the line he'd practiced, voice dipped in false warmth. "We were thinking of visiting this weekend. Bring you dinner, maybe stay a few days." I smiled into the receiver, though he couldn't see it. "That would be wonderful, son. It'll be good to see you both." When I hung up, I stayed seated for a long time, feeling the air shift around me. I could already sense the stage assembling itself, the players, the props, the deception. I stood, stretching, and caught my reflection in the window. The lines on my face looked deeper. Yes, but there was something else there, something Lydia would have recognized. Not bitterness. Not fear. Resolve. "Let's see," I murmured to the night, "what my own blood is capable of." The lake answered in ripples, the sound of water against stone like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. I felt alive again, not in spite of the poison, but because of it. The near death had burned away hesitation, left only clarity. Tomorrow I would drive to Florence. Isabel would help me write a new script, and Daniel, my son, would walk straight into it, smiling all the while. Florence greeted me with rain, soft, apologetic rain that clung to the cobblestones like it didn't want to leave. The drive from Verona had been quiet, the wipers marking time, while my thoughts arranged themselves into something sharper than grief. The villa's silence had started to suffocate me. Florence, even under clouds, felt alive in ways I had forgotten how to be. Isabel's office occupied a restored palazzo near Piazza della Repubblica. I had walked those marble halls before, usually to sign deals that made me wealthier. This time, I came to sign something else, a performance. Isabel stood as I entered, tall, composed, her dark hair pinned with a kind of precision that made you wonder what she looked like when she let it fall. "Edward," she said softly, stepping forward. "You look better than the last time I saw you. Or maybe just more dangerous." "Both," I said, taking her hand. "I need a favor that will make you question your ethics." She smiled. "You've said that before. Come." Her office smelled faintly of jasmine tea and rain. I took the chair across from her desk while she reviewed the notes I had sent the night before, encrypted, cautious. She read in silence, her eyes narrowing slightly when she reached the part about the poison. "Your son," she said finally. "You're certain. As certain as a man can be, without dying twice." She exhaled, tapping a manicured nail against the table. "And you don't want to involve the police?" "Not yet," I said. "If I accuse him, he'll deny it, destroy evidence, vanish. I'd rather watch him first. Let him think I trust him again. Let him dig his own grave." Isabel nodded slowly, understanding. "So what do you need from me?" "I want you to draft a trust," I said. "Make it look like I'm transferring my entire estate, company proceeds, villa, investments, to Daniel and Sophie. Fake documents, fake signatures, everything convincing enough to make greed move faster than reason." Her eyebrow arched, a small gesture of admiration. "And the purpose? To see how quickly they start circling the carcass," I said. Isabel leaned back in her chair. "You always did think like a strategist, Edward, even in grief." I looked at her, and for a moment the professional facade slipped. There was something in her eyes, concern, perhaps affection, that reminded me what it felt like to be seen without being judged. "Grief has a way of making clarity cruel," I said. We worked through the afternoon. By dusk, the documents lay neatly printed, embossed, sealed with false authority. The legal theater was perfect. Only I, Isabel, and one of her most trusted clerks knew the truth. The rest would look real enough to make Daniel believe the future was finally his. Before leaving, Isabel poured us each a glass of Barolo. "To justice," she said. I hesitated, then smiled. "To pretending." The wine tasted like dark cherries and secrets. She held my gaze as we drank, her expression unreadable. For a brief, suspended second, I wondered if she understood how lonely vengeance felt, or if she was too professional to let it show. As I stepped out into the street, Florence had turned golden again. The rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening like wet marble. I felt the pulse of something dangerous in me, power, perhaps, or vindication. For the first time since the restaurant, I was no longer the victim. The next morning, I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and carefully casual. "Dad, how was Florence?" "Productive," I said. "Listen, Daniel, this little scare I had, it made me think. About the future. About the family." He paused, wary but intrigued. "What kind of thinking?" "I'm arranging the inheritance properly," I said, letting the bait sink in. "Isabel's preparing a trust for you and Sophie. That way, everything's secure. You won't have to wait for, well, time to take its course." The silence that followed was electric. I could almost hear his pulse through the phone. "Dad, that's incredible. I don't even know what to say." "Then don't," I replied lightly. "We'll review everything in a few weeks. Isabel will send the documents." He was breathing fast. "You mean it? You really want us to?" "Of course," I interrupted. "You've earned it. It was the lie of a lifetime, and I delivered it with ease." When I hung up, I sat back and closed my eyes. I could almost picture them. Daniel pacing the room, excitement masked as humility. Sophie's calm voice telling him to act natural. She would kiss him, reassure him that they were close to everything they'd ever wanted. And then, later, maybe she'd light a cigarette by their balcony, the smoke rising like a prayer for patience. There was always something about Sophie's restraint that fascinated me, the way she hid her hunger behind grace. I wondered if she had been part of the plan that night at the restaurant, or if Daniel had acted alone. Somehow, I doubted she was innocent. 2 days later, I received a message from Isabel confirming the fake trust was ready. Along with it came a note in her handwriting. They will come running. Be ready to smile. She knew me too well. That evening, I stood on the terrace as the sun bled into Lake Garda. The water caught the light like molten glass. I raised my glass of wine and whispered to Lydia's photo on the wall behind me. If you want to be dead for money, Daniel, I said quietly, let's see what you'll do for it alive. The wind off the lake stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of rain and distant lilac. Somewhere, far below, a fairy horn sounded. Long, mournful final. I smiled. The game had begun. It's strange how easily routine disguises treachery. A week after the call, Daniel and Sophie began appearing at my villa again, like pilgrims returning to a shrine they'd once neglected. They brought gifts this time. Flowers, wine, books about heart health. They even started using words they'd avoided for years, the ones that made them sound like family. Dad, Sophie said one afternoon, her voice a melody of practiced warmth. You should really let us take care of dinner tonight. She stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing a pale blue dress that clung like sunlight to silk. The smell of rosemary and olive oil drifted through the air. She had always been elegant, but now there was something calculated about it, as though she'd studied what kindness should look like and performed it perfectly. I pretended not to notice. Cooking. I said, you never liked the kitchen. She smiled, her lips curling with the soft arrogance of a woman who knows she's being watched. That was before I married a man who burns water. Someone has to keep us alive. Daniel laughed behind her, a sound too loud, too bright. She's right, Dad. You raised a financial genius, but a culinary idiot. Genius. I repeated, letting the word hang. You'll have to prove that one day. He shrugged, still smiling, but I saw the brief flicker of irritation in his eyes. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by charm, that most dangerous disguise of all. We ate on the terrace as the sun folded itself behind the hills. The lake was gold and restless. Sophie poured the wine, careful this time to fill my glass from the bottle, in full view of everyone. She made a joke about my doctor's warnings, and Daniel chuckled too long. I joined in, because pretending had become its own form of warfare. After dinner, Daniel suggested a game of chess. He'd learned from me years ago, but had never beaten me. Let's see if the master still has his touch, he said, grinning. We played in the study while Sophie moved about the house, tidying non-existent clutter. The soft rustle of her dress followed her through each room. I heard her hum once, an old Italian lullaby Lydia used to sing. The sound made my hands tremble for a moment, and Daniel took a pawn with unnecessary satisfaction. You okay, Dad? He asked. Just remembering, I said. He nodded, feigning sympathy, and moved his bishop. I countered swiftly, cornering his queen. He frowned, then laughed. You still play like a general. Only when I know the war's worth winning, I said, meeting his eyes. He didn't understand, but something in my tone made him hesitate before moving again. When they left that night, Sophie leaned in to kiss my cheek. Her lips were soft, deliberate, lingering a heartbeat too long. You're looking stronger every day, she murmured. Her breath brushed my ear, warm and faintly sweet from wine. Daniel worries too much. I watched them drive away, their car's taillights fading down the narrow road. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. I stood on the terrace long after midnight, listening to the waves slap against the dock. The air tasted of salt and suspicion. The next morning, Isabel's message arrived. The first financial report is ready. You may want to sit down. I did. Her investigators had been thorough. Every account, every transfer, every hidden loan was listed. Daniel's empire of arrogance was crumbling. Euro 1.7 million in debt, unpaid mortgages, personal loans from people I wouldn't trust to water my plants. The picture that formed was not of a businessman, but of a gambler. And worse, he had used my name. Lines of forged authorization, falsified signatures, credit tied to my reputation. I scrolled through the report with the slow dread of a man reading his own obituary. Each figure was a confession, each loan a betrayal that reached further back than the poison in my glass. I called Isabel. So, I said quietly, the motive is clearer now. Crystal, she replied. He's desperate, Edward. That kind of debt doesn't vanish, it hunts. And Sophie, her name appears nowhere in his finances. Either she's innocent or she's smarter than he is. I almost laughed. Smart, yes. Innocent? No. That evening, Daniel called again, his voice too cheerful. Dad, I'm glad you're feeling better. Sophie and I were thinking, how about we come by tomorrow? Maybe look over those trust papers together. Of course they were. Perfect idea, I said. We'll review everything this weekend. Isabel's making the final touches. His excitement was unguarded now. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other, his greed dressed as gratitude. When we hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, tracing its edges with my thumb. I imagined Lydia's face again, the way she'd look at me when I had bad news. Her eyes always said, "Don't lie to yourself, Edward. Lies don't save you. They only delay the fall." I was lying now. To Daniel, to Sophie, to myself. But sometimes deception is mercy in reverse. 2 days later, they arrived again, early this time, with flowers and laughter. Sophie wore white, the color of pretense. Daniel carried a bottle of champagne and a folder he pretended not to value. They kissed my cheeks, spoke of family, spoke of love. I smiled through all of it, and somewhere inside me, the last fragile piece of fatherly affection quietly turned to dust. When they finally left that evening, I poured myself a drink and stood by the window. The reflection in the glass showed a man I barely recognized, older, colder, but awake. The lake was black and still, like ink waiting for a signature. Family, I whispered. A word so small it can hide 1,000 crimes. Outside, lightning flickered above the mountains. I raised my glass toward the storm. Let it come. The email from Isabel arrived before sunrise. Its subject line was simple, Report 2. I read it while the lake was still a sheet of smoke under the morning fog. The world was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. The older I get, the more silence feels like confession. It tells you things you'd rather not hear. Inside the encrypted file was a history of my son's ruin, written in numbers. Isabel's investigators had peeled back every polite lie Daniel had built around himself. Bank accounts overdrawn, mortgages unpaid, gambling transfers disguised as consulting fees, loans for men whose names tasted of violence. 1.7 million euros. That was the sum of his hunger. Enough to explain why a son might look at his father and see a target instead of blood. I stared at the figures until they blurred. My coffee went cold, untouched. I felt something like grief, but sharper, more practical. This wasn't sadness anymore, it was arithmetic. The value of my life, measured not in love, but in debt erased by death. When Daniel called that afternoon, I already knew what tone he'd use, careful, contrite, rehearsed. Dad, we were just thinking, maybe we should start helping with your finances. Take some pressure off. I smiled into the receiver. Pressure? I'm retired, not dying. He laughed too quickly. Right. I just mean there's a lot to manage now that the sale went through. Sophie's good with numbers, and I could. Daniel, I interrupted, I've been managing numbers since before you could spell your name. Don't worry about me. He hesitated, then switched tactics. We were actually thinking about buying a smaller place. Something close to you. Maybe the trust could help with that transition once it's finalized. There it was, the ask wrapped in filial affection. I'm sure we can discuss that soon, I said. But right now, I'm focusing on my health. He murmured sympathy, promised to visit again, and hung up. The line went dead, but the performance lingered in the air like perfume after a stranger has left the room. Later, I sat at my desk, the file still open on the screen. Isabel's notes were clinical, efficient, merciless. Subject has borrowed against family reputation. Subject's accounts under scrutiny. Subject at risk of insolvency within months. My son wasn't just reckless, he was drowning. And he had tried to use my name as a life raft. I turned from the screen and looked out at the lake. The afternoon light had gone silver, soft and deceptive. From a distance, the water looked calm, but I knew its currents could drag you under without warning. Daniel had inherited that part of me, the illusion of control. I poured myself a whiskey and sat by Lydia's portrait. Her painted eyes, calm and steady, seemed to question me. I thought success would protect him, I said aloud. That money would make him safe. But money doesn't protect, it magnifies. It makes small flaws fatal. I remembered when Daniel was 13, standing by the dock after losing a boat race. He'd thrown his oar into the lake and screamed, "It's unfair." I told him that life wasn't a race against others. It was a race against himself. He never listened. He wanted to win even when no one was keeping score. Now he was still racing. Only this time, the finish line was my grave. That evening, Sophie called instead of him. Her voice was low, careful. "Edward, I hope we didn't overstep the other day. Daniel just worries about you." "I know," I said, and I meant it in a way she couldn't understand. "You've been through so much," she continued, her tone softening. "Lydia's passing, the business, the stress. Maybe it's time to let go a little. Trust us." Her words were chosen precisely. Trust us. A phrase meant to sound like comfort, but it felt like a lock clicking shut. I closed my eyes, imagining her expression, those deliberate lips curving in empathy, while her eyes calculated distance. "I do trust you, Sophie," I lied gently. "You've been a blessing." There was a pause, almost imperceptible, then a whisper, "You're kind to say that." Her voice lingered in my ear long after she hung up. It wasn't affection. It was control dressed as tenderness. But it stirred something anyway, that inconvenient mixture of attraction and disgust that made my pulse misbehave. Later that night, I opened Isabel's message again. At the end of the report was one final note. "There's more. I've instructed the team to follow Sophie's trail as well. Her activity suggests she's not merely complicit, she's active." I sat back, letting the meaning sink in. I didn't know what Isabel would find, but I already feared it would be worse than Daniel's debts. Sophie was many things, a liar, an opportunist, perhaps a co-conspirator. But she was never careless. Whatever she had been doing behind Daniel's back would not be simple theft. I looked around the study. Lydia's painting, the antique clock ticking too loudly, the untouched glass of whiskey, and realized the villa had become a stage set. Every object was waiting for its cue. Before going to bed, I wrote in my notebook, "Trust is the last luxury of the old. When it's gone, you either die or act." I closed the book and turned off the lights. The house fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of preparation. I lay awake, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling, thinking about the next step. If Isabel was right, and she usually was, then the ledger of lies wasn't finished. It was only half written. And the next entries, I suspected, would bear Sophie's signature. The report arrived 3 days later, shorter than the last, but far heavier. We traced her. Isabel's note began. Sophie's movements, her calls, her messages. "You were right. She's not just complicit. She's orchestrating." I scrolled through the attached transcript, my chest tightening with every line. The investigators had intercepted conversations, emails, even recordings of Sophie's voice, calm and honeyed, speaking to art dealers in Milan, Rome, and Zurich. She wasn't selling her own possessions. She was offering Lydia's. The art collection Lydia had built over 30 years. Our honeymoon painting from Florence, the oil portrait from Siena, even the calm before dawn, her most beloved piece, had all been catalogued, priced, and discreetly pitched for sale. I felt the air leave me in one long, soundless exhale. My fingers trembled as I clicked through the photos Isabel had sent. Grainy images from hidden cameras. Sophie seated at a cafe table, her hair tied back, a silver pen tapping against her chin as she negotiated. The caption beneath one photo read, quote from recording, "My father-in-law isn't well. We're liquidating quietly before the estate goes public." My heart beat once, hard enough to hurt. I closed the laptop and stared at the lake through the wide glass doors. The morning light was too beautiful for the kind of rage that filled me. Lydia's art had been her sanctuary, the one thing that outlived her pain. She had once told me, "When I'm gone, promise me you'll keep them. They'll remind you how beauty survives even when love fails." And now Sophie wanted to sell that promise, piece by piece. I called Isabel immediately. She answered on the first ring. "I've seen enough," I said. My voice came out lower than I expected, a quiet blade. "No more digging. We build the noose now." "I thought you might say that," Isabel replied. Her tone was professional, but beneath it, I heard something like pity. "I can prepare the groundwork. You just have to keep playing your role a little longer." "I can do that," I said. Pretending has become a habit. When I hung up, I sat there for a long while, staring at the reflection of Lydia's favorite painting hanging above the fireplace. The calm before dawn. A soft swirl of violet and pale gold. An ocean caught in that fragile second before sunrise. Lydia used to say it made her feel alive again during chemo. That light was proof of forgiveness. Now, the painting felt like an accusation. That evening, Daniel and Sophie arrived again, uninvited but smiling as if they belonged. Sophie wore red this time, bold, luminous, impossible to ignore. Her perfume filled the hallway before she even spoke. "Dad," Daniel said cheerfully, setting down a bottle of Amrone. "We thought you might like company tonight." "How thoughtful," I said, stepping aside to let them in, though I was expecting a quiet evening with Lydia's paintings. Sophie's smile faltered just a fraction before she recovered. "They're stunning," she said, glancing around the room. Lydia had exquisite taste. I was just telling Daniel they'd be perfect in a gallery, someday. "Perfect," I echoed softly. "Yes, that's one word for it." We dined together on the terrace. The wind had turned colder, and Sophie sat close to the heater, her legs crossed elegantly. I noticed the way Daniel watched her, possessive, almost anxious. Whatever harmony existed between them now was brittle, an alliance forged by necessity. When she reached for her glass, her bracelet caught the candlelight, scattering reflections over her skin. I found myself studying the motion without meaning to. She noticed, of course. She always did. Her lips parted slightly, just enough to remind me that danger often wears beauty's face. "Edward," she said suddenly, her tone soft, coaxing. "You're quiet tonight. Is something wrong?" I smiled, just thinking about Lydia. Her expression softened into practiced sympathy. "She adored you." "She did," I said. "And she adored her art even more." I let the sentence hang, watching her eyes flicker, just once, before she looked down at her plate. "Tell me, Sophie, have you ever been to Zurich?" Her fork froze midair. "Zurich? No. Why?" "Just curious," I said. "Someone mentioned the galleries there are impressive this time of year." She smiled again, too quickly. "Oh, I would know. My travels have been limited lately." Lies always leave a trace. The corners of her mouth trembled ever so slightly before settling. I felt a strange mix of triumph and sadness. I had once hoped to see truth in her face. Now I only hunted for cracks. After dinner, Daniel went to take a call, leaving us alone. Sophie rose and wandered toward the painting over the fireplace. She stopped in front of the calm before dawn, her silhouette framed by its soft gold light. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Lydia had an artist's soul. I sometimes envy that. "You envy everything," I said before I could stop myself. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. The distance between us was charged, something unspoken threading the air. It wasn't attraction anymore, not really. It was recognition. Predators acknowledging each other. Then she smiled, that disarming, dangerous smile. "Maybe," she said. "But envy can be motivating, don't you think?" Daniel returned before I could answer. They left soon after, their laughter echoing down the drive, hollow and rehearsed. When the gate closed behind them, I turned back toward the painting. For the first time, I noticed something strange, the faint outline of dust on the wall where another frame had once hung. One of Lydia's smaller canvases was gone. The realization landed like a blow. Sophie hadn't just been planning to sell Lydia's art. She had already begun. I poured myself another drink and stared at the empty space on the wall. "You were right, Isabel," I whispered. "We've found the rot. Now we let it spread until they choke on it." The lake outside shimmered beneath a half-moon, indifferent and cold. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. It was time to stop mourning. Time to prepare for war. The next report came 5 days later, carried not by email this time, but by Isabel herself. When she appeared at my villa that morning, the first thing I noticed was her expression. Hard, precise, almost surgical. The kind of look people wear when they've seen something that stains the soul. "Edward," she said quietly, handing me the folder. "You should sit down before you read this." I sat. The folder was thin, but heavy in its implications. Hospital papers, scanned documents, a few photographs. I recognized my own signature on the top sheet before I even began to read. It looked perfect, except it wasn't mine. "This," Isabel said, tapping the page, "is a forged medical authorization form. It gives Daniel full control over your health care and decision-making. It was submitted 2 weeks before your cardiac episode." My pulse slowed to a cold, deliberate rhythm. He forged it himself? Our handwriting expert confirms it. But that's not all. Using that authorization, Daniel accessed your hospital records, prescriptions, heart data, allergy information. We traced his searches on a burner phone. The phrases he looked up were, she paused, reading from her notes. Fastest way to induce cardiac arrest. Beta blockers overdose. Natural causes death, no trace. Her words dropped like stones into the quiet room. I stared at her, my hand steady though the air felt thinner by the second. "So he wasn't improvising," I said. "He was rehearsing." Isabel nodded. "You have proof now. More than enough to destroy him legally." "Not yet," I said. "If we expose him now, he'll twist it, claim confusion, concern for my health, some nonsense about misunderstanding. I want him to confess without realizing he's doing it. I want him to hand me the rope himself." Isabel watched me for a long moment. "You've changed, Edward." "I had to," I replied. "He killed what was left of the man I used to be." We spent the rest of the afternoon outlining the plan. The false trust, the meeting in Florence, the staged signing that would become the stage for truth. I could see the concern in Isabel's eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no turning back. When she left, the villa felt emptier than before. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, watching the last threads of daylight die over Lake Garda. My own reflection looked back at me, older, yes, but sharper now, stripped of illusions. Lydia once told me that pain has 2 choices. It either breaks you or sculpts you. I was beginning to see which one I had chosen. The phone rang just after sunset. Daniel. His timing had become predictable, almost mechanical. "Dad, I was thinking about your next checkup. Maybe I should come along next time? Help manage the paperwork." I almost laughed. "That won't be necessary, son. Isabel's handling everything." A beat of silence. "Oh, right. Of course." His tone shifted, too casual. "She's always been loyal to you." "She has," I said. "Loyalty's rare these days." He didn't respond. I could almost hear him thinking, searching for a new angle. He found one. "Sophie says we should plan a family dinner soon. Maybe celebrate the trust once it's signed." "That's a wonderful idea," I said smoothly. "Let's make it memorable." When I hung up, I sat in the dark for a while, the phone still warm in my hand. I should have felt anger, but what I felt instead was detachment, an odd kind of calm. Rage is a young man's luxury. At my age, betrayal doesn't ignite you. It cools you, until all that remains is purpose. Later that night, I found myself in Lydia's old study. Dust had gathered on her books, her sketches, her unfinished letters. I opened one of the drawers and found her rosary, still tangled with a faded ribbon. I traced the beads with my thumb, not in prayer, but in remembrance. "You warned me," I whispered to the quiet room. "You said he'd see me as an obstacle." A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Outside, the lake shimmered like a mirror cracked by moonlight. I felt a strange sense of company, as though Lydia were there not to comfort me, but to witness what was coming. 2 days later, I received Isabel's confirmation. All the evidence was ready. The recordings, the forged papers, the financial data. Even Sophie's voice caught on tape discussing liquidating assets quietly. Every sin had been cataloged, documented, preserved. A perfect web. But before we could pull the final thread, I needed to see them again. Not as adversaries, but as family. I wanted to look at them and know, with certainty, that there was nothing left to save. That weekend, I invited them for lunch. They arrived as usual, laughing, affectionate, radiant with deceit. Sophie wore cream-colored silk. Daniel had the self-assured posture of a man who thought the world was about to open for him. We ate in the garden. The air smelled of lemon blossoms and rain. I watched them perform their parts. Sophie complimenting the wine, Daniel making plans for the trust, their smiles perfectly synchronized. I responded with calm civility, though every word tasted like ash. After dessert, Daniel leaned back and said, "You know, Dad, it's amazing how everything's finally coming together. You've worked your whole life for this. Now it's time to enjoy it." "Perhaps," I said, "but I've learned enjoyment requires something most people can't afford." "What's that?" he asked. "Conscience." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. Sophie smiled faintly, but her eyes darted toward him, searching for cues. I noted every movement, every tremor. They were nervous, even if they didn't know why. When they finally left, I walked back into the study and opened Isabel's folder again. I looked down at my forged signature, perfect in its deception. "So this is what you think my name is worth," I murmured. "A shortcut to freedom." Outside, thunder rolled again, the storm drawing closer. I poured myself another drink, the amber liquid catching the light like fire behind glass. For the first time in months, I didn't feel old. I felt ready. The father in me was gone. Only the strategist remained. Florence shimmered that morning as though it knew something extraordinary was about to happen. The air was crisp, the Arno glinting beneath a soft winter sun. I arrived at Isabel's office early, my pulse steady, my mind sharpened by months of deception. The city smelled of espresso and rain-washed stone. For the first time since the night at the restaurant, I felt completely alive. The conference room on the top floor was prepared with Isabel's meticulous precision. White marble table, leather chairs, silver carafe gleaming under the light. At the center lay 5 folders, perfectly aligned. The bait, the trap, the ending, and the beginning of everything. Isabel entered a few minutes later, composed as ever, a silk blouse beneath her dark jacket, her hair drawn back neatly. "They confirmed?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "They think they're coming to sign the trust." Her eyes softened briefly. "Edward, this will destroy them." I met her gaze. "No, they destroyed themselves. I'm just turning on the lights." We waited in silence for nearly 20 minutes, the kind of silence that grows heavier with purpose. Then, through the glass wall, I saw them. Daniel in a tailored navy suit, Sophie beside him in emerald silk that matched her eyes. They looked radiant, successful, confident. The perfect couple walking into their coronation. The door opened, and Daniel's smile was bright enough to fool any stranger. "Dad, you look incredible," he said, stepping forward to hug me. "Retirement suits you." I returned the gesture, my hand steady. "You too, son. Florence becomes you." Sophie leaned in next, kissing my cheek with lips that smelled faintly of bergamot and control. "We were thrilled when you called," she said. "It's such an honor to be part of this." "Honor." I nearly laughed. Isabel motioned for us to sit. Her voice, smooth and professional, filled the room. "Senior Halston, as discussed, we're here to finalize the Halston Family Trust." She opened the first folder with a measured grace. "Before we proceed, there are a few preliminary matters to review." Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, impatient. Of course. Whatever's needed." Sophie smiled, her hand brushing Daniel's under the table. I watched their fingers intertwine, a gesture that once might have moved me. Now it only reminded me of snakes coiling together before the strike. Isabel began slowly, her tone neutral. "Our firm requires confirmation of certain details, medical, financial, and legal, before the transfer can be completed. Just formalities." She slid one of the folders toward Daniel. "If you don't mind, please verify your acknowledgement here." He took the pen eagerly. "Absolutely." But his confidence began to flicker as he flipped through the first few pages. He frowned. "What is this?" "Just documentation," Isabel said. "Routine checks." I said nothing. The air between us thickened. Sophie leaned closer to glance at the papers. The color drained from her face. "Daniel." He turned another page, and I saw his expression fracture. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, voice sharp now. "This is private." "Private," Isabel repeated, her tone edged with quiet steel. "You mean the loans under your father's name? Or perhaps the gambling debts? Maybe the forged authorization granting you control of his medical decisions?" Sophie's eyes widened. "What?" she whispered. I finally spoke, calm and deliberate. "Please, Isabel, continue." She opened the second folder. "This contains recordings of your wife contacting art dealers across Europe. She's been attempting to sell Lydia Halston's private collection, illegally. We have timestamps, phone transcripts, even video footage. Shall I play it?" Sophie's lips parted, but no words came. Her skin had gone pale as porcelain. Daniel looked at her, betrayal blooming in his eyes, ironic, almost comical, given the company. "What the hell is this?" he said, rising slightly from his chair. "You're setting us up." "No," I said softly. "I'm showing you the truth." He froze, caught by something in my tone. He'd never heard me speak like that before, controlled, certain, beyond the reach of pity. I watched the realization dawn in him. The performance was over, and he wasn't the lead actor anymore. He was evidence. Sophie turned toward me, her voice trembling. "Edward, please." "Sit down," I said, and to my surprise, she obeyed. The authority in my voice wasn't fatherly. It was final. Isabel laid out the remaining documents, one by one, each folder another wound. The poison analysis, the financial statements, the forged signature, the list of debts and calls. The evidence was overwhelming. With every revelation, the silence deepened until the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of Isabel's Cartier watch. Daniel slumped back into his chair, his jaw clenched. "You had me followed," he said bitterly. "I had to," I replied. "I almost died." Sophie's hand trembled as she reached for a tissue. "Edward, we..." "Don't," I said. "You rehearsed enough lies already." The room felt colder now, though sunlight still filtered through the glass walls. Isabel's voice broke the stillness. "Before we conclude, I have one final document. You both have a choice." She slid 2 papers toward them. Option 1, formal charges, attempted murder, fraud, forgery. Option 2, immediate relinquishment of all claims to the Halston estate. You leave with nothing. Your house, your cars, your accounts, everything transfers back to Edward. You disappear. If you accept, there will be no trial. But if you refuse, her pause was surgical. You will spend the rest of your lives trying to prove you aren't guilty. Daniel's hand shook as he took the pen. Sophie started to cry softly beside him. Real tears this time, not performance. He signed first, his jaw set in fury. Then he shoved the paper toward her. She hesitated, looked at me once, searching, maybe for mercy, and found none. She signed. Their tears stained the ink. When they were done, Isabel collected the papers, stacked them neatly, and nodded to me. It was finished. Daniel rose, without a word. Sophie followed. At the door, she turned back, her eyes glistening. "You win," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "No, I survive." They left, their footsteps fading into the marble hallway. I stood by the window, watching the light shift over the Arno, my reflection ghosted against the glass. Isabel placed a hand on my shoulder, steady, reassuring. "It's over," she said. "Not quite," I replied. "It's never really over when it's family." Outside, the city glowed with indifferent beauty. I felt the first ache of something I hadn't allowed myself in months. Relief, tinged with grief. The kind that doesn't heal. It simply hardens into memory. The storm had passed, but I knew its echo would live inside me forever. I thought the moment they left, I would feel triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow, like a cathedral after the candles have burned out. For a long time, I stood by the window, watching Florence hum beneath me, the streets alive with people who would never know that, in a single room above them, a family had just quietly died. Daniel and Sophie were gone, stripped of wealth, name, and pretense. But victory, I discovered, is a poor anesthetic. It numbs nothing. It only leaves silence. Isabel poured me a glass of water and placed it on the table beside me. "You should rest," she said softly. "I've been resting for months," I replied. I gestured toward the stack of sign papers. This was the only thing keeping me upright. She nodded, understanding more than she said. "They'll comply. My firm will ensure they vanish quietly. You'll never hear from them again." I looked down at the final folder on the table. The evidence, the signatures, the ink still drying. Everything that had once been love was now paperwork. "Do you think," I asked quietly, "that a man can forgive without forgetting?" Isabel met my eyes. "Forgiveness is a kind of surrender. I don't think you're built for that." I almost smiled. "No, I suppose not." We spoke little after that. She arranged the documents, slipped them into her briefcase, and left with a professional farewell that managed, somehow, to feel personal. When the door closed behind her, the silence that returned was different this time. Lighter, but lonelier. I was free, yes, but freedom always cost something. Mine had cost blood. I stayed in Florence for 2 nights, walking the city like a ghost. I visited the Duomo, the Uffizi, even the bridge where Lydia and I had once stood, feeding crumbs to pigeons and laughing like children. It was there I finally let myself cry, not for Daniel, not for Sophie, but for the part of me that had still believed I could save them. On the 3rd morning, I returned to Verona. The villa greeted me with its usual quiet grace, the scent of pine and lake air filling the halls. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. I wandered through the rooms, touching the edges of Lydia's furniture, the frames of her paintings, the curve of the piano she used to play. When I reached the fireplace, I stopped. The calm before dawn hung above it, still luminous, still whole. Sophie hadn't managed to sell it. That, at least, felt like a mercy. I poured myself a drink and sat facing the painting. The golden hues seemed softer now, the light gentler. "We're alone again, Lydia," I said quietly. "Just as you warned." Her absence filled the room more completely than her presence ever had. I thought of Daniel as a child, running through the garden with scraped knees and laughter, of Sophie's first dinner at our table, nervous and charming. How easily we mistake charisma for character. How easily we choose beauty over truth. By evening, the house was filled with long shadows. I made dinner, simple pasta, olive oil, garlic, and ate alone. The wine tasted different now, clean, untainted. I realized I was tasting honesty again, and it felt almost foreign. The next morning, a letter arrived by courier. No return address. I recognized the handwriting instantly, Daniel's. I opened it, half expecting venom, but what I found instead was desperation. "Dad, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even ask you to. I just need you to know it wasn't meant to happen this way. I thought I could fix things. Sophie pushed, and forget it. There's no point explaining. I hope you're happy now. You've got everything. Maybe you always did. D." I folded the letter once and set it in the fireplace without reading it again. It caught easily, curling into ash. Words are cheap when they come too late. That afternoon, I met Isabel one last time. We sat on the terrace overlooking the water. She looked tired, perhaps from the moral weight of what she'd helped me accomplish. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Live," I said, "and make it mean something." She smiled faintly. "That sounds like redemption." "Not redemption," I corrected. "Reclamation." Before she left, she pressed a small envelope into my hand. "Something you'll need." Inside was a document, a legal transfer establishing the Lydia Halston Foundation. Her idea, a way to turn the fortune I'd kept from ruin into something luminous. "Use it," she said, "to build, not destroy." When she was gone, I sat with the papers, running my fingers over Lydia's name. It felt right. It felt clean. The war was over. Now came the rebuilding. That night, I dreamed of Lydia again. She stood by the lake, the water calm, the horizon washed in pale gold, the same light from her favorite painting. She didn't speak, just smiled, and in her eyes I saw something like approval. I woke before dawn, the sound of rain whispering against the windows. In the stillness, I realized something. Revenge is not justice. Justice restores balance. Revenge only empties you. But sometimes emptiness is necessary before you can begin again. I rose, poured myself coffee, and stepped out onto the terrace. The lake glimmered beneath the soft drizzle, patient and eternal. I thought of Daniel and Sophie somewhere far away, beginning their new life in exile, poorer but still alive. Maybe that was punishment enough. Maybe time would do what I couldn't, teach them shame. Behind me, the painting glowed in the early light, its colors awakening with the dawn. For the first time in months, I felt no weight on my chest. I whispered to the lake. We turned poison into 3 months later. Florence and for the first time since that night the air smelled of wisteria and paint, of creation, not decay. The Lydia Halston Art Center opened that morning under a sky so clear it looked deliberate, as if the heavens themselves wanted to bear witness. I stood at the entrance beside Isabel, watching guests arrive. Young painters, students, critics, patrons, each carrying portfolios, dreams, or both. Their laughter echoed through the marble courtyard, a music I hadn't heard in years. For once, I wasn't the richest man in the room. I was simply the one who'd given others a beginning. Inside, sunlight streamed through tall glass panes, falling across white walls hung with art from Lydia's collection. Each piece looked alive again. The calm before dawn occupied the central wall, restored and radiant, its colors luminous as breath. That was her favorite, Isabel said quietly, standing beside me. I know, I murmured. She said the light in that painting reminded her that morning always returns, even after the darkest night. Isabel looked at me, her expression soft. Then you've honored her perfectly. Maybe. But the truth was, this foundation wasn't just for Lydia. It was for me, too, for the man who'd once lost himself in bitterness and found his way back through creation. Revenge had emptied me. This work refilled me. The ceremony began. A young violinist played softly as the audience gathered. I stepped up to the podium, the murmur of voices fading into quiet. My reflection in the polished glass behind me was almost unfamiliar. Older, yes, but unburdened. Art, I began, was my wife's language. She spoke through color, through silence, through light. When she died, I thought that language died with her. I was wrong. A hush filled the hall. I continued, voice steady. This center isn't about me, or even about Lydia alone. It's about the belief that beauty, once created, outlives betrayal. That creation is the purest form of forgiveness. I paused, letting the words breathe. We all lose something. Sometimes we lose love. Sometimes trust. But if we can build something after that, something generous, then perhaps we haven't lost everything after all. Applause rose gently, sincere, unforced. When it quieted, a young woman approached the stage, a student painter from Naples whose work had won the Foundation's first grant. Her eyes shone as she spoke. Mr. Halston, your gift changed my life. I can paint again. I can dream again. Her sincerity pierced me more deeply than I expected. I smiled, placing a hand over hers. No, my dear, you changed mine. Her tears mirrored my own, though mine stayed unseen. The crowd clapped again, but their applause felt distant, muffled by emotion. Afterward, I walked through the galleries alone. Every step echoed softly across marble and memory. Lydia's presence seemed everywhere, in the scent of oil paint, in the tilt of the light, in the whispers of the students discussing brushwork with the fervor of believers. At the far end of the main hall, a small bronze plaque had been mounted beneath her painting, The Calm Before Dawn, donated by Edward Halston, in memory of his wife Lydia. For those who believe light can be rebuilt. I touched the plaque gently, tracing her name with my fingertips. You were right, I whispered. Beauty outlives everything. Outside, the sun lowered itself toward the Arno, gilding the water in gold. The same color Lydia had always called the shade of redemption. I walked onto the terrace where the city stretched before me, alive and loud and endlessly human. Isabel joined me, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "To Lydia," she said, raising hers. "To second chances," I answered. We clinked glasses, the sound soft and clear. The wine tasted of berries and warmth, different from the bitter drinks of that night in Verona. It was the taste of peace, at last. She looked at me thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "you could have disappeared after everything. Most men would have hidden. But you built something instead." "Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't done," I said. "That there's life after disappointment." She smiled. "You proved it." As twilight deepened, I stayed on the terrace long after everyone had gone, watching the city's lights flicker to life. In the reflection on the glass door, behind me, the calm before dawn glowed softly, its painted horizon endless. For a moment, I felt Lydia beside me, not as memory or ghost, but as the quiet certainty that I had finally honored her. I thought of Daniel and Sophie somewhere far away, anonymous, stripped of pretense. I no longer hated them. I no longer needed to. The past had already claimed what it wanted from me. The rest belonged to the future. I lifted my glass to the horizon, where the last light of day dissolved into evening. "We turned betrayal into art," I whispered, "and pain into purpose." The wind carried my words into the fading sun. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace, not because the story had ended, but because it finally had meaning.